Hello, everybody. Today we're going to talk about the election of 1980. Now, last couple times we were together, we talked about how the Jimmy Carter presidency was not going so great by the election year of 1980. Carter had been elected in 1976, kind of in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal, but by 1980, Jimmy Carter's presidency is going through a very rocky time period, as we have said in previous videos. So the Republican Party realizes there is a chance to get back into power. Now, in the 1980 Republican Party primary, the two main guys that are going to go up against one another for the Republican nomination are Governor Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, who had a very long resume of reasons why he should be president. We'll talk about him coming up later. But it's a very back and forth primary at the beginning, with eventually Ronald Reagan emerging victorious. Now, at the Republican convention in 1980, Reagan had not decided upon a vice presidential nominee. And there were all these rumors circulating that former President Gerald Ford was going to become the vice presidential nominee for Ronald Reagan in 1980. But when Gerald Ford went on TV right in the middle of the convention and he said that his role would not be vice president, but it would be more of a co-presidency, Reagan, watching the interview on TV, was like, I can't have that. You can only have one president at a time. So he calls up George Herbert Walker Bush, who had been his rival for the Republican nomination, and he says, hey, George, why don't you be my vice presidential nominee in 1980? And George Bush, of course, accepted, giving us the famous Reagan-Bush ticket of 1980 and 1984. But now we have to go into the general election, where Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush will go up against Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale. Well, the Carter people agree to have a debate with Ronald Reagan because they believe that Ronald Reagan is an intellectual lightweight and that Jimmy Carter can mop the floor on a televised debate with Ronald Reagan and secure re-election. They could not have been more wrong because in the first debate that they had, in their debate, Reagan and Carter, they kind of go back and forth for the first hour or so of the debate. Nobody's clearly winning, but Reagan is clipping off some of these neat little catchphrases. He looks at Jimmy Carter at one point on a piece that Jimmy Carter was kind of exaggerating, and Reagan goes, well, there you go again. And, of course, everybody at home kind of thought that was funny. But it was what Reagan said at the very end of the debate that solidified his 1980 presidential victory. And that, of course, was he looked in the camera and asked the American people, he said, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? That's my terrible Ronald Reagan impersonation. And the majority of Americans said at home were going, no, I'm not better off than I was 4 years ago. The Jimmy Carter presidency is not helping me. So that little phrase and Reagan's background as an actor, and we'll talk more about his biography in the next lecture, helped Reagan connect with the American people. And on election night, 1980, usually the results come in at like midnight or much later. It's a long, drawn-out process. Reagan's victory over Carter was so absolute and so complete that they were able to call the election as a Reagan victory basically before the primetime hour of TV was even over. And as a matter of fact, when Jimmy Carter realized that he had thoroughly been beaten, he calls the hotel room that Ronald Reagan was staying in to concede. And Reagan was in the shower. And Ronald Reagan's wife, Nancy Reagan, answered the phone. She goes over to the bathroom door and she knocks. And she says, Ronnie, telephone. And he gets out of the shower and he's dripping everywhere. He has a towel around him. And he looks at her and goes, well, who is it? She goes, Jimmy Carter. And he goes, there's no way. It's too early. But Reagan picks up the phone. And it is Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter concedes to Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan has now become the president-elect of the United States of America. Now, the Reagan years are going to be very interesting. They kind of give a rebirth to the American spirit, and we'll talk about that in upcoming lectures. I might even be completely decked out in Reagan gear because I shockingly own so much of it. I own a lot of historical shirts and hats. I don't know why, because I don't really wear them that often. But in the next couple of lectures, we'll look at the Reagan years. We'll look at why Reagan is significant. And then we will have the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush. So next week, we'll dive into the Reagan years, and I hope to see you all very soon.